More than 170 years ago, in an isolated plantation stretching across thousands of acres in the interior of Georgia, a man named Jeremiah Whitmore made a decision that would unknowingly preserve evidence of his darkest secrets. In the spring of 1852, when photographic processes were still exclusive luxuries, available only to America's wealthiest families, Whitmore commissioned a daguerreotype, not a simple portrait, but a carefully orchestrated statement of power, permanence, and dynasty. He had accumulated wealth beyond measure through decades of exploitation, and now he wished to immortalize his image for posterity, to ensure that future generations would know his name and remember his prominence. The photographer, a traveling artisan named Matthias Holloway, arrived at the plantation with his equipment carefully packed in leather cases. Holloway was renowned throughout the South for his technical precision and his ability to capture the subtle markers of status that distinguished the planter elite from ordinary citizens. Whitmore had spared no expense. He instructed his household staff to prepare the main veranda with meticulous care. The white columns were whitewashed until they gleamed, the mahogany furniture was polished until it reflected light, and the background was arranged to showcase both the architectural grandeur of his estate and the expansive lands that represented his wealth. On the day of the sitting, Whitmore dressed in his finest clothing, a dark suit tailored in Philadelphia, a silk cravat imported from England, and a gold pocket watch that hung visibly from his waistcoat. He positioned himself with deliberate authority, one hand resting firmly upon a mahogany table laden with documents that supposedly represented his property deeds and business records, the other hanging naturally at his side. His expression was stern, befitting the gravity of a man of consequence. Behind him, the veranda framed the vista of his plantation lands, the rows of crops stretching toward the horizon, a visual representation of his dominion. Holloway worked methodically, adjusting the daguerreotype plate, calculating the precise exposure time necessary to capture detail without overexposure. The process was slow and deliberate. There would be no second chances, no ability to retake the image if something went wrong. The pressure was immense. Whitmore stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, maintaining his stern expression, while Holloway counted the seconds under his breath and monitored the light's angle. When it was complete, Holloway carefully removed the plate, sealed it within its protective case, and assured Whitmore that the image was captured with exceptional clarity. The daguerreotype was crated carefully and sent north to be hand-tinted and mounted on a backing board. When it returned to Georgia several weeks later, Whitmore displayed it with undisguised pride. The image was extraordinary, technically perfect, artistically composed, a masterwork of mid-19th century photographic achievement. Whitmore had copies made, sending them to prominent galleries in Charleston, Savannah, and Atlanta. The portrait was exhibited as an example of American daguerreotypy at its finest. Art critics marveled at Holloway's technical skill. Museums competed to acquire copies. Historians would later study it as a significant artifact of Southern planter culture. For 171 years, the daguerreotype remained largely unchanged, preserved in climate-controlled archives, occasionally loaned to exhibitions, studied by scholars of photography and American history. It traveled through time encased in glass and backing board, a silent witness to the transformation of America. Wars came and went. Slavery ended, though its legacy persisted. The 20th century arrived and passed. The photograph aged gracefully, its silver surface developing the characteristic patina of aged daguerreotypes, its image remaining clear and sharp despite the passage of generations. In 2022, the Regional Museum of Atlanta received a substantial grant to undertake comprehensive restoration and preservation of its 19th century photographic collection. Among the pieces selected for intensive analysis was the Whitmore daguerreotype, catalogued simply as Jeremiah Whitmore Planter, 1852. A conservation photographer named Dr. Marcus Chen was hired to oversee the project. Chen had spent 2 decades studying 19th century photography, and he approached each image with meticulous care and genuine scholarly curiosity. He had developed an almost intuitive sense for photographic anomalies, moments when something in the composition seemed deliberately or accidentally out of place. When Chen began his initial examination of the Whitmore daguerreotype using high-resolution digital imaging and specialized light analysis, he followed standard protocol with precision. He documented the overall condition of the plate, noting minor scratches and the natural aging of the silvered surface. He adjusted contrast and brightness, examining different wavelengths of light to assess preservation. He was performing these routine procedures when something extraordinary caught his attention. In the background of the image, in the shadowed corridor that extended from the veranda into the plantation mansion, there was a figure, not clearly visible to the naked eye, requiring magnification, contrast adjustment, and careful layer analysis to discern, but undeniably present, a human silhouette standing motionless in the shadows, watching. Chen's heart quickened. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The figure remained. It was not a photographic artifact or a trick of light. It was intentional. Someone had been standing there when the daguerreotype was taken. Someone whose presence suggested either carelessness in composition or deliberate inclusion. Either way, it represented something that no one had noticed in 171 years of viewing this photograph. Chen documented his discovery with meticulous precision, photographing the enhanced image from multiple angles, creating digital reconstructions with various contrast and brightness settings. Then he contacted his supervisors. Within hours, the discovery had been escalated to the museum's director. Within days, it had been shared with the State Historical Society, and within weeks, it had attracted the attention of historians, archivists, and forensic photography experts who began to converge on the museum, each bringing their own expertise to bear on the question. Who was this figure in the shadows, and what did her presence in this photograph reveal about the man she stood behind? Chapter 2. The Figure in the Shadows. The silhouette in the background of the Whitmore daguerreotype became the subject of intense forensic analysis. Expert photographers worked with digital enhancement tools to clarify what had remained invisible for nearly 2 centuries. As the image gradually resolved through careful manipulation of light, contrast, and color channels, a more complete picture emerged. The figure was unquestionably a young woman, photographed in profile against the darker interior of the veranda corridor. Her body language was revealing, rigidly upright, her shoulders drawn back in a posture that suggested tension or constraint rather than relaxation. Her head was positioned to show her profile, and though her features were not sharply defined in the daguerreotype, her youth was apparent. She appeared to be no older than 20, possibly considerably younger. The woman wore a simple dress made of what appeared to be cotton fabric, rough woven and unadorned. There were no decorative elements visible, no lace, no ribbons, no jewelry of any kind. Her hair was covered partially by a head wrap, a common garment among enslaved women in the 19th century South, though the photograph's resolution did not permit definitive confirmation of the wrap's material or color. Most strikingly, her feet were bare. In an era when even modest footwear was a marker of social standing and respectability, the woman's bare feet were unmistakable evidence of her status. The positioning of the figure within the composition suggested that her presence had not been accidental. She stood at a precise distance from the main subject, far enough to remain in shadow, but positioned directly behind Whitmore in the background corridor. A photographer of Holloway's skill would not have failed to notice such a figure before beginning the long exposure. The question became, Why had Holloway permitted her to remain in the frame? And more provocatively, had Whitmore known she was there, or had her presence in the photograph been a form of silent testimony? Dr. Sarah Mills, a historian specializing in enslaved narratives and oral histories of the American South, was brought into the investigation. Mills was a black woman in her mid-50s, descended from families that had been enslaved in Georgia and whose ancestors had lived through the very period depicted in the daguerreotype. She had spent her career recovering narratives that official historical records had systematically excluded or obscured. When she first examined the enhanced image of the figure in the shadows, she experienced a visceral response. A recognition that this was not merely an interesting photographic anomaly, but potentially direct visual evidence of a human being whose life had been systematized erasure. Mills began by researching the plantation records associated with the Whitmore estate. Official documentation listed 47 people enslaved there in 1852, but the records provided minimal personal information, mostly names, ages, and categories of labor. None of the enslaved individuals were photographed, and none were identified by individual portraits. The plantation's written records were sparse regarding daily operations and contained virtually no information about internal organizational structures or special circumstances affecting particular enslaved people. However, Mills discovered something significant buried in the courthouse archives of the county seat. A series of legal documents relating to disputes between Whitmore and neighboring planters over property and contractual matters. Within these documents were references to special arrangements and particular labor agreements that suggested Whitmore's plantation operated under conditions somewhat different from typical agricultural enterprises. One letter, written by a neighboring planter to another, made a bleak reference to Whitmore's reproductive enterprise, a phrase that was cryptic but troubling. Mills expanded her research, seeking oral histories from elderly residents of the region, descendants of enslaved people who had lived in the area during the 19th century. The responses were initially cautious and guarded. Generations of silence had created patterns of protection around certain topics, but gradually, as Mills established trust and demonstrated her genuine commitment to recovering suppressed narratives, some individuals began to share family stories that had been transmitted orally across generations. Recurring themes emerged, references to a special program, and to women who had been isolated from the general enslaved population, to children who had been systematically separated from their mothers, and to a systematic secrecy surrounding these practices. One elderly woman, Mercy Johnson, age 89, finally granted Mills an extensive interview. Johnson was a descendant of individuals who had been enslaved on or near the Whitmore plantation. She possessed a remarkable family artifact, a diary that had been passed down through female relatives across generations. The diary was written in a cipher, a substitution code that had been created deliberately to conceal its contents from anyone who might discover it. Mercy had grown up hearing fragments of stories about the diary, but the actual meaning of its contents had remained a mystery until now. Johnson showed the diary to Mills with trembling hands. She explained that her family had always known it contained important information, but the code had never been fully deciphered. The women of her family had preserved it as sacred, recognizing that it documented something of profound historical significance. As Mills carefully examined the handwritten pages, photographed the entries, and began preliminary analysis of the cipher pattern, she realized she was looking at first-hand documentary evidence of crimes that had been perpetrated in near-total secrecy, recorded by a woman who had lived through them and preserved through an act of generational commitment to truth-telling. The diary was written in a woman's hand, careful and deliberate despite the constraints under which it must have been created. The entries began in 1851 and continued sporadically through 1858. Many pages were missing, torn out or lost to time and circumstance, but what remained created a fragmentary but coherent narrative of systematic abuse, reproductive control, and institutional cruelty. The author identified herself obliquely as L, and her entries referenced other women only by initials or nicknames, suggesting a deliberate effort to protect identities while documenting events. The woman in the shadows of the Whitmore daguerreotype finally had a name, Lydia, and through her diary, recorded in secret cipher, would come the revelation of a horror that had been carefully concealed for more than 170 years. Chapter 3. The Code Within the Silence. The cipher in Lydia's diary was a relatively straightforward substitution system. Each letter of the alphabet had been replaced with a corresponding letter from a shifted sequence. However, without knowing the precise shift pattern or the keyword that governed the system, decryption would have been challenging for anyone without specialized training. Mercy Johnson mentioned that family oral tradition suggested the keyword was a name, though she could not remember which name had been passed down in the stories her grandmother had told her. Dr. Mills worked with specialists from Emory University's linguistics department and with historians who had previously studied period cipher systems. Using computational analysis combined with historical context, frequency analysis of English, the limited vocabulary likely used in plantation records, and variations typical of mid-19th century amateur ciphers, they began to identify patterns. After 3 months of intensive work, they identified the shift pattern, a 7-letter shift with a keyword that governed variable shifts. The keyword, when finally deciphered, was Lydia, the name of the diary's author, used as a cipher key to conceal her own story, as the text gradually resolved into readable English. The researchers encountered a narrative so disturbing that they approached their work with reverent care, aware that they were translating testimony from a woman who had endured systematic abuse and had risked discovery to document her experience. The early entries from 1851 described Lydia's arrival at the Whitmore plantation following her purchase at an auction in Charleston. She had been 16 years old. The entries from her first months recorded conventional tasks: work in the main house, assistance with cooking and cleaning, standard domestic labor. But entries from 1852 changed dramatically in tone and content. Lydia began to reference selection, special instructions from the master, and repeated mentions of something she called the program of the future. Her language became more guarded, suggesting increasing awareness of danger in documentation. She wrote about being isolated from other enslaved people, about being confined to specific areas of the plantation, about restrictions on her movement and communication. She referenced physical examinations conducted by a man she called the physician, who visited the plantation periodically and conducted inspections that she recorded with evident distress and shame. The entries described other women, initials only, who were similarly isolated and subjected to similar examinations and restrictions. Lydia documented pregnancies, births, and systematic separations of infants from their mothers. She recorded these events with restrained language, using clinical terms rather than emotional descriptions, but the horror of the experiences was evident beneath the careful word, choices. She wrote of production of offspring, of successful outcomes, of failures, and of removals, language that suggested an industrial process rather than human reproduction and maternal bonds. Most disturbingly, Lydia documented that this was not an isolated practice, but rather a systematic program involving multiple plantations and multiple perpetrators. She recorded visits from other planters, conferences between Whitmore and neighboring plantation owners, and references to the Association, an organizational structure that seemed to coordinate reproductive control across multiple estates. She mentioned correspondence with lawyers and physicians, suggesting professional involvement in the program's operations. Historians cross-reference Lydia's diary entries with records from other plantations in the region and with surviving correspondence between planters. Patterns emerged, confirming the existence of a coordinated reproductive control program. References that had seemed cryptic in isolation became coherent when analyzed in relation to Lydia's testimony. Agricultural associations had been utilized as covers for meetings where reproductive improvement had been discussed. Correspondence between planters contained veiled references to programs, selections, and special maintenance. Ledgers from multiple plantations showed unusual line items for special housing maintenance and medical consultation fees that corresponded with periods when Lydia's diary documented intensive program activities. The program was not hidden entirely. It had existed in a grey zone of semi-public knowledge among the planter elite. References appeared in private letters, in ledgers, in the casual comments of planters who seemed to assume that such practices were widely understood and accepted among their social class. What had been hidden was any official acknowledgement, any legal documentation, any formal record that could be used to prove the program's existence. Official records had been carefully curated to exclude mention of these practices. Enslaved people had been systematically prevented from testifying or documenting their experiences, and the broader public, both in the North and South, had been kept ignorant through deliberate obscuration. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. Lydia's deciphered diary provided documentary evidence of systematic reproductive abuse on a scale that shocked even historians accustomed to studying slavery's brutalities. The entries spanned 7 years, documenting the experiences of at least 11 women subjected to the program. While many entries were fragmentary and some pages were entirely missing, what remained created an undeniable record of deliberate, systematic cruelty designed to maximize reproductive output while minimizing emotional bonds and enslaved agency. The diary was Lydia's testimony from beyond death, speaking across 170 years to accuse those who had tortured her and those who had benefited from her suffering. Chapter 4. The bones in the well. Following the initial discoveries regarding the scope and nature of the reproduction program, authorities and historians worked together to petition for archaeological investigation of plantation properties where such activities had been documented or suggested. The process was contentious. Descendants of planter families argued that excavation was disrespectful desecration of ancestral burial grounds. Current property owners expressed concerns about legal liability and unwanted publicity. But mounting public pressure, combined with the undeniable evidence of Lydia's testimony, eventually prevailed. In May 2023, more than 170 years after Lydia's final diary entry, a team of forensic archaeologists arrived at the Whitmore plantation with excavation equipment and began systematic investigation of a particular well located approximately 200 meters behind the main plantation house. The well had been officially closed in 1890, more than 30 years after slavery's abolition, according to county records that simply noted it had become inadequate for use. No explanation had been provided, no reason given for why a reliable water source would be abandoned without comment. The excavation began cautiously, with surface surveys and ground-penetrating radar to establish subsurface conditions. The well's upper structure had been deliberately filled with dirt, stone, and clay, creating a solid cap that would have been intentionally constructed to prevent access. Once this cap was carefully removed, a process requiring several days of meticulous labor, archaeologists began systematic excavation of the well's interior contents. At approximately 3 meters depth, human remains began to appear. Fragments of bone, initially scattered, then increasingly concentrated. As excavation proceeded carefully downward, the quantity of remains increased dramatically. Skeletal material accumulated, suggesting multiple individuals rather than isolated burials. Careful documentation recorded the location of each fragment, the context of surrounding soil, and any associated artifacts or materials that might provide dating or identification information. The excavation continued for 6 weeks. When it was complete, the archaeological team had recovered remains belonging to at least 23 individuals. Forensic anthropologists examined each skeletal fragment with meticulous attention. Age estimations were established through bone development and fusion patterns. Sex determinations were made through pelvic morphology and other skeletal markers. Pathological analysis identified evidence of disease, injury, and trauma preserved in bone. The results were devastating. Of the 23 individuals, 17 were female. The majority were in their reproductive years, estimated ages ranging from 14 to 40. The youngest remains belonged to what appeared to be infants or very young children. Several sets of remains showed evidence of genetic relationship through DNA analysis, suggesting family groupings, mothers and children, siblings, or other close relatives who had apparently been disposed of together. Most disturbingly, the forensic analysis identified evidence of reproductive trauma on multiple skeletons. Several female skeletons displayed characteristic bone deformations associated with repeated childbirth. Others showed evidence of pelvic trauma consistent with obstetric complications. One skeleton, belonging to a young woman estimated at 19 or 20 years of age, bore tragic testimony to death during childbirth. Her fetal remains were preserved still within her skeletal pelvis, never delivered, never separated from her body. She and the unborn child had apparently been simply discarded in the well together, alive or dead. Radiocarbon dating of bone samples placed the remains within a time frame consistent with the mid to late 19th century. Roughly 1845 to 1875, overlapping entirely with the period documented in Lydia's diary. Isotopic analysis of bone chemistry suggested that these individuals had been consuming diets typical of enslaved populations in the region. DNA analysis compared with modern populations descended from enslaved people in the region showed high probability matches with several individuals who came forward after the discovery. The well had functioned in effect as a clandestine mass grave, a disposal site for bodies that could not be explained through official channels. The Whitmore plantation had been literally built upon hidden death, with the physical evidence of crimes preserved beneath layers of soil and deliberate forgetting. The bones bore witness to systematic abuse, to reproductive exploitation, to forced confinement, to death without medical care, to the casual disposal of human beings who had been reduced to property and then to waste. News of the discovery generated international attention. Media outlets reported the findings with varying degrees of sensationalism and sensitivity. Some focused on the dramatic aspect of hidden graves and plantation secrets. Others engaged in more serious historical analysis of the structural systems that had permitted and concealed such crimes. The state of Georgia issued an official statement acknowledging that systematic abuse had occurred and that further investigation was warranted. Families descended from individuals associated with the Whitmore plantation began to emerge, seeking information about ancestors who had disappeared into historical silence. Some brought family stories that correlated with Lydia's diary entries and the archaeological findings. Others sought confirmation of long-held suspicions about what had happened to relatives whose fates had never been explained. The bones in the well, finally removed and treated with archaeological care, became material evidence that validated oral histories that official records had suppressed. Chapter 5. The letters that couldn't be burned. While archaeological investigation proceeded at the plantation site, historians and archivists expanded their documentary research into legal records, correspondence, and property documents that might provide additional evidence regarding the reproduction program's operations and the network of individuals who had been involved in perpetuating it. This research led to a significant discovery in an unexpected location: the attic of a private residence in a town approximately 30 miles from the plantation. The house in question had belonged historically to Charles Hutchinson, a lawyer who had practiced in the region during the mid-19th century. Hutchinson had served as legal counsel to multiple planter families, including Jeremiah Whitmore. He had maintained a large private library and had preserved extensive correspondence and business records. Following Hutchinson's death in 1901, the house had passed through several owners and had eventually been purchased by a couple planning renovation and modernization. During preliminary cleaning before renovation, they discovered in the attic a sealed wooden box bearing a date inscribed on its surface, 1875. The date was significant. 1875 marked the year Hutchinson had abruptly ceased his legal practice and relocated to Philadelphia, abandoning his established career and community connections without explanation. The sealed box appeared to contain papers, and the family contacted the County Historical Society to inquire whether the contents might be of historical significance. What emerged from the box was a collection of more than 80 letters and legal documents, all preserved in remarkably good condition by the dry attic environment. These letters represented correspondence between Hutchinson and various planters, including multiple letters addressed to or concerning Jeremiah Whitmore. The correspondence spanned approximately 20 years, from the mid-1830s through the early 1870s, and documented a deliberate, coordinated effort to conceal criminal activity through legal manipulation, falsification of records, and institutional silence. One letter, dated April 1854, was particularly revealing. Addressed from Hutchinson to Whitmore, it discussed the matter of Lydia and her current productions. Hutchinson wrote, "I have consulted with the others regarding your inquiry about disposition and record-keeping. The consensus advises the following approach. Maintain the legal fiction that the subject remains domiciled at your estate, while arranging de facto transfer to property controlled by James Thornton. Her birth records shall be annexed retroactively to Thornton's plantation documentation, creating the appearance that she was born and has always remained there. Whitmore plantation records should document her departure by death from pulmonary illness, with the date of death established as June of 1856. I'm enclosing a death certificate already completed in standard form, requiring only your signature and seal for official validity." This single letter provided irrefutable evidence of systematic falsification of official records. It confirmed that Lydia had not died on the Whitmore plantation, but rather had been transferred to another location, presumably because she had become troublesome or because her productive capacity at Whitmore had been exhausted. It demonstrated coordination between multiple legal professionals in perpetuating the fraud. It showed the calculated manner in which crimes were concealed through the manipulation of official documentation. Other letters detailed the mechanisms of the broader coordination network. References appeared to the Association, not an officially registered organization, but an informal coordination among planters who met regularly to discuss strategy and share techniques. Letters mentioned meetings at agricultural expositions, private conferences at planters' homes, and correspondence through seemingly innocent commercial and legal channels. Attorneys had been centrally involved in structuring the program to minimize legal exposure while maximizing the program's operational scope. Most significantly, the letters revealed what amounted to a conspiracy of silence, an explicit agreement among network members to deny the program's existence if it were ever questioned or challenged. One letter, dated 1868, stated explicitly, "Should any matter relating to the program ever become subject to legal inquiry or public discussion, we have collectively agreed upon a unified position of absolute denial. No individual will acknowledge the program's existence or his own participation. Should any member of our association contemplate deviating from this position, he shall face immediate social ostracization and shall be subject to legal action regarding his own records and practices." The conspiracy of silence had been not merely implicit, but explicitly organized through legal correspondence. Those involved had understood that if the program's full extent were ever revealed, they would face criminal charges and social condemnation. They had therefore created a unified defensive structure, a mutual protection pact that would be maintained through threat, coercion, and controlled access to documentation. This arrangement had apparently been effective, remaining in place even after slavery's abolition and continuing through the remainder of the 19th century. The letters were authenticated by archival experts and legally transferred to the State Historical Society. They became official evidence in historical record and were incorporated into academic publications and public discourse regarding the program's operations. The legal and documentary evidence, combined with Lydia's testimony from the diary and the forensic evidence from the well, created a comprehensive evidentiary foundation that could no longer be denied or dismissed. Chapter 6. The Weight of Inherited Shame. As public awareness of the Whitmore Plantation Program expanded through media coverage, academic publications, and educational initiatives, the question arose regarding how descendants of both perpetrators and victims would respond to documented historical truth. Some planter descendants responded with categorical denial, arguing that the evidence was fabricated or misinterpreted. Others adopted defensive postures, acknowledging only the minimum necessary facts while emphasizing mitigating circumstances or contextual factors. But one descendant made a different choice. Eleanor Whitmore, a woman in her 60s who carried Jeremiah Whitmore's surname, though she was not a direct descendant, initiated contact with Dr. Sarah Mills and requested a meeting. Eleanor had spent months researching her family's history and had discovered information that she felt compelled to share publicly. She organized a press conference in Atlanta, standing before journalists and historians to address questions regarding her family's historical legacy. Eleanor began by explicitly acknowledging the documented evidence of the program: the diary, the letters, the bones, the falsified records. She stated unequivocally that her family had benefited from crimes and that no rhetorical repositioning could undo that reality. But she also revealed something that had remained hidden. Her own family possessed documents that further incriminated Jeremiah Whitmore and other program participants, documents that she believed should be made public. Specifically, Eleanor revealed the existence of a sealed letter written by her grandmother, Victoria Whitmore, dated 1945, and bearing the instruction to be opened only after my death. Victoria had been born in 1872, 2 years after Jeremiah Whitmore's death. She had grown up within the family culture of the plantation and had lived her entire life bearing knowledge of the program. Victoria had died in 1965, meaning the letter had been sealed for 60 years before Eleanor discovered it during family property settlement procedures. Eleanor shared the letter's contents with the assembled media. Victoria wrote, "I have carried knowledge of my father's sins for my entire adult life, having learned of his actions as a child and having lived with the moral burden ever since. I witnessed the arrival of young women at our plantation. I heard screams in the night emanating from the special houses. I observed my stepmother's complicity in supervising the program. I knew, absolutely and unambiguously knew, that systematic horror was occurring beneath our family's roof. Yet I maintained silence. I never spoke publicly. I never attempted to stop the abuse. I never sought to protect the victims. My silence was itself a form of participation. Victoria's letter continued. I have spent 70 years living with the knowledge that I was too cowardly to act, too invested in my family's comfort to risk exposure, too embedded in the structures of white supremacy to prioritize the humanity of my father's victims. I permitted the comfort of my own position to outweigh my moral obligation to bear witness and speak truth. My grandmother, my mother, and we are all complicit through our failure to resist. I leave this letter as acknowledgement of my own moral failure and as a plea to future generations. Never permit comfortable silence to substitute for moral action. Never accept the pretense that non-participation constitutes innocence. Eleanor Whitmore told the assembled media that Victoria's confession had transformed her own understanding of complicity and responsibility. She had spent the subsequent months researching additional family documents and had found evidence of her family's continued financial benefit from program proceeds well into the 20th century. Investments and business interests that had been seeded with capital derived from the program's operations. She announced that she was establishing a foundation dedicated to historical education about slavery's systematic brutalities and was committing substantial personal resources to support scholarship focused on recovering suppressed narratives. If this story has already captivated you, leave a like. This helps the story of the Whitmore family reach more people. The community of descendants of enslaved people associated with the Whitmore plantation organized a comprehensive memorial initiative. Using documentation recovered from archives and assisted by genealogical researchers, they compiled a list of names, 23 individuals whose remains had been discovered in the well, plus additional individuals documented in the diary whose fates remained unknown. These names were inscribed on a memorial stone placed at the site, transformed into a historic crime site maintained by the state. In 2024, a formal dedication ceremony was held. Families traveled from across the country. Descendants of Lydia and other victims stood at the memorial. Many visiting the site for the first time, many hearing for the first time the official acknowledgement that their ancestors' suffering had been real, documented, and worthy of remembrance. Historians delivered addresses placing the Whitmore program within broader contexts of slavery's systematic violence. Clergy offered prayers and blessings. The silence that had protected the program for 172 years was finally and irrevocably broken. Chapter 7. The Portrait. Recontextualized. The daguerreotype of Jeremiah Whitmore, which had initiated the entire investigative chain, underwent a dramatic transformation in how it was presented and understood. Following the comprehensive documentary and forensic revelations, the Smithsonian Institution made the decision to withdraw the portrait from its conventional exhibition of significant examples of 19th-century American photography and to relocate it to a new permanent exhibition explicitly dedicated to exploring visual evidence of historical crime. The new presentation of the Whitmore daguerreotype was fundamentally different from its historical display. Rather than being positioned as an artistic achievement or technical accomplishment, it was contextualized as an artifact bearing direct visual testimony to systematic abuse. An extensive interpretive plaque accompanied the image, explaining the discovery of the figure in the shadows, her identification as Lydia through the diary, and her documented subjection to the reproduction program. The plaque read, "Lydia, BC 1835, enslaved on the Whitmore plantation in Georgia, appears in the background of this daguerreotype, taken in 1852. Her presence in the photograph, captured against her will and rendered nearly invisible by the photographer's deliberate compositional choices, represents one of the few visual records documenting an individual subjected to the reproduction program that operated across multiple plantations from the 1840s through the 1870s. Lydia's survival through oral tradition transmission to her descendant Mercy Johnson and her carefully concealed diary written in cipher provided crucial testimony to crimes against humanity. Forensic analysis confirmed Lydia's diary accounts, identifying remains of at least 23 individuals in a mass burial at the plantation site. Lydia herself disappeared from official records in 1858. Her remains were identified through DNA analysis and genealogical research and were reinterred with full ceremonial honors in 2024. This photograph stands as evidence that victims' testimonies endure and that truth, though suppressed, cannot be permanently concealed. The daguerreotype became an iconic image within scholarly circles and within broader public discourse about slavery and historical documentation. It was reproduced in academic journals, in museum catalogues, and in educational materials used in high schools and universities throughout the United States. Each reproduction was accompanied by the full narrative: Lydia's story, the diary's discovery and decryption, the forensic investigation, the legal evidence. The image served as a starting point for deeper conversations about how historical artifacts can contain meanings and testimonies that are not immediately apparent. It illustrated how visual sources require interrogation, how context matters profoundly, and how the absence of acknowledgement does not equate to the absence of documented reality. Students studying the daguerreotype were encouraged to develop skills in visual analysis, to consider what objects reveal about power, complicity, and documentation, and to recognize that historical interpretation is an ongoing process that can be transformed through new evidence and refined understanding. Tourist groups visiting the Smithsonian now regularly include the Whitmore daguerreotype in their itineraries, not to admire its technical achievement, but to stand in the presence of material evidence of injustice, and to contemplate how such horrors could be perpetrated and then concealed for nearly 2 centuries. Teachers brought students specifically to examine the photograph and discuss what it revealed about systemic crime and institutional complicity. The portrait of Jeremiah Whitmore, intended as a monument to his power and status, had instead become a permanent indictment of his crimes. Chapter 8. The archives that couldn't lie. Parallel investigations conducted throughout 2023 and 2024 in archives across Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama revealed that the Whitmore reproduction program was neither unique nor exceptional, but rather represented one node in an extensive network of similar operations. The program existed within a broader regional system of reproductive control that crossed state boundaries and involved dozens of plantations and hundreds of enslaved women. Historians discovered that elite agricultural associations, organizations ostensibly dedicated to improving crop yields and farming techniques, had functioned as coordination centers for sharing reproductive control methodologies. Meeting minutes, preserved in Historical Society archives, contained discussions of genetic improvement, selective breeding programs, and reproductive optimization that, when analyzed in relation to other documentary evidence, clearly referred to forced reproduction. Correspondence between association members contained veiled references to special populations, productivity benchmarks, and interstate transfers that tracked individual women's movements between plantations and documented systematic tracking of reproductive outcomes. Surviving ledgers from multiple plantations revealed unusual expenditure categories that correlated with the reproduction program. line items for special housing maintenance, physician consultations, security enhancements, and specialized provisions appeared during periods and at quantities inconsistent with ordinary plantation operations, but entirely consistent with the confinement and supervision required for reproductive control. Cross-referencing these ledgers with Lydia's diary entries demonstrated precise correlation. Entries describing pregnant women's confinement corresponded exactly with ledger entries documenting special housing expenses. Divorce records from the county courthouse revealed that numerous white women had petitioned for divorce on grounds of infidelity with enslaved property, a phrase that encoded systematic sexual violence while simultaneously reducing it to a marital indiscretion. The court records documented that such cases were frequently dismissed or withdrawn without resolution, suggesting a deliberate institutional unwillingness to formally acknowledge or legally sanction documentation of sexual abuse. Yet the very existence of the petitions demonstrated that white women within planter families were aware of the abuse and that they understood it as sufficiently serious to constitute grounds for legal action, even though the legal system was unwilling to provide remedies. An extraordinary discovery was made in the personal papers of a retired circuit court judge, William Thornton, who had presided over legal proceedings throughout the region from 1860 to 1890. In his private journals, Thornton recorded his awareness of the reproduction program, his knowledge that falsified records were being created and processed through his court, and his deliberate decision to remain silent and complicit. He wrote, "I am aware that systematic crimes are being perpetrated within this judicial district. I have received documents bearing obvious signs of falsification. I have heard testimony suggesting abuse of enslaved women by planters with whom I socialize. Yet I have chosen not to investigate, not to pursue charges, not to disturb the arrangements that permit the operation of the planter economy. My silence is calculated and intentional. I have sacrificed my integrity for social position and financial security. This is the price I have accepted for remaining within the circles of power." Thornton's journals provided extraordinary testimony to deliberate institutional corruption and complicity at the judicial level. The legal system had not merely failed to address the crimes, it had actively participated in concealing them through systematic refusal to investigate and prosecute. Newspaper archives, searched using advanced digital text analysis, revealed that references to the reproduction program had appeared periodically in oblique form throughout the 19th century. Society gossip columns had reported indiscretions of gentlemen, coded language for sexual abuse. Agricultural journals had published articles discussing reproductive optimization, using terminology that was scientifically obscure but that corresponded precisely with the program's operations. Even abolitionist newspapers from the North, while focusing on slavery's brutality in general terms, had occasionally published allegations regarding systematic reproductive abuse on Southern plantations, allegations that contemporary readers had largely dismissed as propagandistic exaggeration. The truth, in other words, had never been completely hidden. It had been articulated, but in coded language, in fragmentary references, in forms that permitted those who chose not to acknowledge it to maintain plausible deniability. The systematic obscuration had been not a failure to communicate, but rather a deliberate encoding that allowed perpetrators, complicit witnesses, and institutional actors to maintain the appearance of ignorance while operating with full knowledge of the reality. Chapter 9. The Silent Stones Speak. In 2025, the property that had formerly constituted the Whitmore Plantation was officially designated by the state of Georgia as a historic crime site. a designation created specifically for locations where documented, systematic criminal abuse had been perpetrated and concealed. This designation differed fundamentally from the conventional historic site category. Rather than celebrating historical accomplishment or cultural achievement, the Historic Crimes Site designation required explicit documentation of crimes, provision of victim testimony, and educational programming that addressed perpetrator accountability and institutional complicity. Federal funding was allocated to transform the plantation property into a comprehensive memorial and educational institution. The primary plantation house, the various outbuildings and the grounds were carefully preserved but reorganized with new interpretive frameworks. The special house, the structure where Lydia and other women had been confined during the reproduction program, was restored and presented with extensive historical documentation. Excerpts from Lydia's diary were displayed alongside architectural evidence, personal artifacts recovered during archaeological investigation, and oral testimony from descendants. The well where remains had been discovered was sealed with transparent materials, permitting visitors to view the burial site while respecting its sacred nature as a grave. A stone memorial bore the names of 23 individuals whose remains had been recovered, along with additional names of individuals documented in the diary whose fates remained unknown. The memorial stone displayed not just names, but also fragmentary biographical information. Birth years when known, relationships when documented, creating a recognition of these individuals as distinct human beings rather than abstract statistics. Educational programming at the site included workshops for teachers, facilitating integration of the Whitmore case into curriculum addressing slavery, historical documentation, and institutional accountability. Schools throughout the state began organizing field trips, bringing students to confront material evidence of systematic crime and to contemplate how educational systems had previously omitted or obscured such evidence. Discussions following site visits addressed questions such as, why had this evidence remained concealed for so long? What educational and institutional failures had permitted such concealment? What are our contemporary responsibilities regarding historical truth-telling? Researchers continued to discover additional evidence. New documents were uncovered in previously inaccessible archives. DNA analysis identified additional remains from the well, establishing relationship connections and permitting descendant families to claim ancestors and include them in family histories. Each discovery added layers to understanding of the program's scope and duration. Academic publications multiplied. Journal articles, book-length studies, dissertations, all contributing to the growing historical record. The daguerreotype of Jeremiah Whitmore remained at the Smithsonian, but had achieved iconic status within American historical consciousness. It appeared in documentary films, museum exhibitions, academic lectures, and educational materials. The image of the man intended as a testament to achievement had instead become a symbol of historical crime. And the woman in the shadows, Lydia, whose presence had remained invisible for 171 years, had finally been acknowledged, named, and recognized as a person worthy of remembrance. The inscription on the memorial stone at the plantation included words from an oral testimony delivered at the 2024 dedication ceremony by one of Lydia's great-great-grandchildren. My ancestor's name was Lydia. She lived. She suffered. She documented her suffering in secret. She survived in the memory of her descendants who preserved her words across generations of silence. Today we stand at this memorial and say her name aloud. We bear witness to her testimony. We refuse the erasure that others attempted to impose. Lydia was here. Lydia matters. Lydia's truth endures. In 2025, The state of Georgia published an official comprehensive historical report documenting the reproduction program, the network of perpetrators, the institutional complicity, and the mechanisms through which evidence had been suppressed. The report acknowledged that official history had failed earlier to recognize and teach these realities. It committed educational institutions to incorporating these histories into curriculum and to developing pedagogical approaches that centered victim testimony and historical accountability. It represented a formal institutional recognition that the suppression of historical truth had been a systemic failure and that rectification required dedicated commitment to documentation, education, and remembrance. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore Plantation. We'll see you in the next video.